Welcome back. It is episode 124. I'm your host, Jacob Harris, and this podcast is brought to you by Achievement Apex. Oh, I just screwed up my own intro. Look at that. Achievement Apex and Power Pit Rockingham in association with Bulk Chalk or Bulk Gym Chalk and Ped Test Australia. And I will also give a shout out to our newest sponsor, which is Rockingham Supplement Mart. Today, I'm joined by Ben Yanes. Thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. Appreciate it, and I appreciate you waking up at 5 a.m. or whatever the hell time it is by you to do this. So I'll forgive any sort of verbal mismatch here, just because I know it's early by you and it's later by me. So I got the upper hand in that regard, but excited to be here, excited to talk.
Thanks, man. I'd just come in and edit it later, and then it will sound perfect, and you'll be like, you know
Uh,
what I mean?
yeah, see, it's not as authentic that way, but it's okay.
No, I probably should edit things sometimes, but then I think sometimes I've had technical difficulties, and I'm like, you know what? Let the listener feel it. You know, they should be involved.
Yeah,
So
I'm with you, 100%.
I will say that I'm lucky here. I don't know what it's like there. I don't know what the weather's like here at the moment, but in Australia, it's pretty good because at 5 in the morning, the sun was out. So is it, yeah, where specifically are you again? Because I thought it was like New York
Yeah,
based.
right outside of New York. So basically the sun doesn't really even rise in the last 2 weeks and in the following like 6 or 7 or 8. And it sets at about 4 p.m., 5 p.m. So I mean the sun is already set right now and it's 5 p.m. by me. So good stuff, good times.
Yeah, well, at the moment it's not going down to like 7:30, 8 o'clock here. It's almost
Yeah.
inconvenient if you want to go to bed early. Um,
It's a
yeah,
good
look,
problem to have.
yeah, it's definitely not a yes, it's not a bad problem. I will start with a question that has been on my mind since we had spoken about talking again, and I guess I would like to ask you what is it that defines a modern meathead?
Hmm. Yeah, so I've been asked this question a couple times, and several times I've answered it differently. I think one time I answered it in too much of an esoteric kind of a way, where I went on this ramble about, the philosophy and then the next time I think I overcompensated and I sort of oversimplified the message. And I basically just said that the concept of a modern meathead is one who trains like a meathead, but who also reads. That's also sort of an oversimplification. And I think the most appropriate description or definition would be something in the middle, something that strikes sort of the middle ground between those two extremes. And so it's basically just the archetype of person who loves to train, is into training, and is into training in all the right ways, like for, muscle growth purposes, strength growth purposes, not someone who just likes to train so that they can take a video and post it, right? Someone who really is passionate about, training hard, lifting heavy, all of the sort of typical gym broette stuff. And then simultaneously, the modern meathead is a person who, in addition to the display of, those physical desires or those sort of different kinds of output in terms of just passion for the weight room and what it actually creates in terms of effort. The modern meathead is a person who takes the next step, right? Which is essentially asking questions that relate to the why behind exercise. So, why does this exercise do one thing and that exercise does another? And what that sort of questioning allows for, I think, is a deeper understanding of the more technical aspects of lifting. And so what you end up with is a person who is not only incredibly passionate and has the gall and the willingness to train hard and to do hard things, but someone who is also willing to do the intellectually challenging side of things, to sort of create this synergistic effect that hopefully, over a longer period of time allows for the same or at least better results, all the while incurring fewer negative consequences like joint deterioration and just, the negative outcomes of lifting that we all are probably familiar with, that we all probably don't desire. joint pains, joint fatigues, muscle tears, which to some degree are inevitable, right? But essentially, the pursuit of the modern meathead is to be able to train hard and to be able to do it for as long as possible in a way that is by nature, as sustainable as possible. So hopefully that wasn't, too far esoteric or too oversimplified. And I think a good way to think about it, in maybe more familiar terms and less descriptive terms, is just the science-based, bro. And unfortunately, the phrase science-based has become, I think, poisoned in a lot of ways, which maybe we can get into it at some point talking about. But just, the person who is both physically curious and intellectually curious is how I'd sort of summarize that.
Yeah, I think the way you put it is probably, I don't know how you've explained it in the past. Obviously, you've kind of mentioned you've done it a few different ways, but that's probably the understanding that I would have had just from your content and obviously talking to you before. And I kind of like think the approach is becoming more popular, people caring about that sort of thing more. Although it's still funny to see but Ronnie Coleman was bigger than you comments still, because it's sort of like, or just the kind of the old school bodybuilders did this, and it's still funny to see that stuff because there's still people that are on that level. But I feel like it's still becoming more common now to see people care about, like, no, I don't want to have like a bad back when I'm 40, and I don't care about lifting heavy if it's going to come with that cost and things like that. So I would say that probably for you, the good thing about what you're saying is, when we spoke last time and we kind of mentioned this, like, you had, yeah, maybe 5,000-6,000 followers, and now it's reaching that 200 mark. You've clearly, started to catch attention. And then there's also, right, there has to be a lot of people that are agreeing with you, right? People that are following you because they like your content. So there's obviously a lot more people following that, as opposed to people getting popular because they're just like, oh, lift heavy, or like swing around and do a bent over row like this and all that. I feel like that content is getting a little bit more pushed out, but I would like to kind of delve into that, what you mentioned about the science-based stuff, because I definitely see that that's where there's been like that line of like, there's kind of crappy content and it was like just lift or whatever. And then there was like a period of, I'm not going to mention certain people, like, because but there's kind of like, don't touch your chest with a bar on bench press because it's bad. And like kind of this, it was sort of heading in science based, but then it was still a bit broy. And then science based, I will use like maybe like Jeff Nippard as like an example. Like that's where he used to do all that. But then there was a lot of people doing it. And then, as you've said now, that's kind of gotten tiresome. And there's this kind of new part where we're still kind of trying to be science based, but you don't even want to say that because it's so like been around all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think where I'll kind of start with this is just the fact that I think social media in its own sort of way is completely antithetical to what the nature of science represents. So the nature of science, I think most people think that when they hear the word science, they think the word fact, right? So they associate science with fact and don't necessarily realize that just assumption to begin with is a conflation, right? Science, I think, if anything, is more similar to, if you wanted to really, really simplify it down to what fundamentally it is, it's exploration, right? And it's exploration to essentially gather data to move us in particular directions. I really like the saying that science is based on support. It's not based on fact, right? Because when we think fact, we think set in stone. And whenever you hear an actual scientist, someone who is actually scientific in their research or in the way that they teach or in the way that they even learn, you hear a lot of uncertainty and you hear a lot of contextualization, right? Just expressed in their, read any conclusion in any published paper ever, even if the paper itself is super limited in terms of its application, the researchers will always say, it is likely that it may be that future research, that we should do on this topic should be X, right? Because of these limitations. So science is essentially this like sport of how much can I caveat and how much can I present to the world that I am in fact uncertain about what I'm doing, but hey, here's what I found, right? Now, social media is like if you could flip science perfectly on its head, social media is the opposite, right? Because no one wants to open their phone and consume a piece of content that is like, well, this thing may be better for some people and this thing may be better for others. So let's talk about like which people this may be better for and which people this may be worse for and everything in between. Like no one, people just want you to get straight to the point. And so it's this very tough balance to strike between being scientific, right, in the real sense of the term, and being someone who's capable of growing an audience, maintaining an audience, and satisfying an audience without sort of losing the integrity of what would what would be scientific, right? And so that for me has been, I think, the most challenging thing over time. And as I'm sure anyone who has followed my content since I don't know 5,000 6,000 followers has sort of recognized as my messaging has changed, I think, quite drastically from a much more polarizing sort of nitpicking approach to now I just try to be a lot more informational about what I put out. And I think that overall, the a big part of the reason that I made that change is because when you make content that is purely made for the purpose of polarization and making this camp over here angry and this camp over here excited, what you do is you rob that person or those people who consume your content of the ability to actually start to think something for themselves. And when you provide someone information and you say, hey, here's what we know about this thing. Here's the general structure of the elbow. Here is the general structure of the shoulder. Here's how this pull down may be better for you, or this, row may be better for you. You give that person an opportunity to absorb information rather than to absorb dogma and to absorb emotional bias. And you allow that person, and in some ways, you give that person tools to be able to actually think for themselves and learn for themselves. And I think that that is a sort of as a transitional thing um, where I've moved toward over time because I started to recognize that like this whole campaign of just growing on social media for growth's sake, it gets you, to a certain place, like you have access to more people and that's great. But ultimately, I think a lot of people end up in positions where they have these massive audiences who are just not really in a position to either monetize their following like someone might want to. And they haven't really garnered respect because all they do is sort of make shit posting content to get clicks and to get likes, right? So back to this whole science-based thing, I think this science-based thing is something that is prominent in the industry currently because we're at this weird sort of like intellectual precipice where a lot of people are or were at one point really poo-pooing all the science-based stuff. And now that like more jack people are starting to talk more about it, those people who before were maybe more skeptical are now kind of like, you don't really hear it as much, at least as far as I see. Um, but what has now happened is now we've swung the pendulum too far in the other direction to where, to give one example, like this lengthened partials thing, it's like if I hear one more fucking person talk about how like the lengthened partial is better than the shortened partial, without any context, without any degree of nuance to, okay, what are the population study? What muscle groups are you talking about? What was the resistance direction they were using? What was the profile they were using? Who was, how many people, right? So there's just 1,000 different questions that can be sort of extracted from one single claim. And unfortunately, what has happened with the science trend now is we've moved away from bashing science, which is like thumbs up, I think, in many ways. But now we've moved almost too far in that direction to where the second that we see a new study, the second that we hear a new claim, the second that this influencer says this about this research, now all of a sudden it's like we've gone too far in this direction. And so we've sort of eroded the fabric of science in a little bit of a different way to where now, okay, more people are involved, and that's probably a good thing on average. But now we've sort of missed the point of what we're trying to do with science to begin with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've seen that recently. I want to touch on a few things you said, but I've seen that recently with ice baths. That's been an interesting one because
In which direction?
in the direction of, I mean, it started as like, I felt like I didn't really hear about them a couple of years ago. Like people did them, but it wasn't much of a thing where now people are doing them and there's a lot of growth hormone or testosterone benefits and stuff like that. And there is some stuff to back that. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, that sort of makes sense. But it just became incredibly popular to the point where like we have a couple of places. I live in like a pretty small place. I mean, I'm in Perth, right? You know, we're isolated, but then I live in like a place that's even like shittier and smaller than that. And we have multiple places in probably like 15 minutes from me right now where I can like go and it's just like a business has opened and it's just like an ice bath and a sauna and you can just like go back and forth between them and and on the wall it has like all the benefits and it's like I'm not saying they're not there, but it's interesting that it kind of came out of nowhere. And then, as you kind of mentioned before, a new study just came out the other day and it was like it's not optimal for hypertrophy, right? If you're trying to build muscle, you want inflammation so that your body can recover naturally. So if you try to speed that up by blunting that inflammation and getting in an ice bath right after you've done a strength training session or a bodybuilding type session, that would not be optimal. That doesn't seem like it would be a good idea. And that doesn't seem like maybe we had to figure that out almost to me because I'm a little bit like, well, we already knew what we were trying to do. We wanted the body to recover, and sleep and nutrition and things like that. And we want it to recover like we do after we train. So anything that's going to speed that up doesn't necessarily sound like a great idea. For athletic performance, that's a whole different conversation. But since that came out, it's like everyone's talking about it, right? So all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, you think ice baths are good? Well, this study came out and it's just like, yeah, but what if someone's not a bodybuilder, right? Someone's a long distance runner. They don't give a shit. They don't care about muscle mass. For them, they need to be able to run again the next day. So that's kind of what you were talking about, where like something's good and we have science to support that it's good. But then like a study came out and everyone's like, whoa, and then there's like people on YouTube with like thumbnails and it's like a guy who's like, and it's like, is it good? And that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. And I think that broadly speaking, a good takeaway from this conversation is that you should be very hesitant to label anything as purely good or bad without sort of context around that particular thing. And I think that to the point that you just made around, ice baths and recent studies, and I'm sure more research will continue to come out that will conflict with previous research, right? All that just points to this idea that, again, science is based on support, it's not based on fact, right? So again, when you see a single study in a single context come out, you should be very, I think, careful of listening to anyone that makes an absolute claim that is based on a single data point, right? Because that's ultimately what a study is, right? Unless we're talking about, a series of studies or a review or a meta-analysis or something like that, which may in fact really point, a large arrow in a specific direction. You have to consider things like, again, like all the things I mentioned earlier, like population size and just even things like timing, what was the timing in relationship to the people who were training and were seeing maladaptive effects from the ice bath, right? Like if you train quads and calves and then 30 seconds later you jump in freezing water for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that effect that you see from that is likely going to be different from if you were to wait 30 minutes or 2 hours or a day or 6 hours, right? So it's just all I think comes back to, what are the specifics of the research and how may I extract information to point me in a direction, but not this, what is happening now, which is just completely ignoring things like effect size, completely ignoring things like specific population and timelines and all that stuff. And almost in a sort of, I think, unethical sort of way, we're seeing science being sort of weaponized to support particular programs, to support particular kinds of maybe course material that says if you learn this thing and you use this method based on recent research, like this will be the outcome. Those kinds of things, I think, start to get me a little bit more genuinely upset because, not only are you misinterpreting data either intentionally or unintentionally, but now you're using it for financial profit and you're taking money out of, someone's pocket. So that's where it starts to get, I think, really into the weeds and potentially, toward the ethical side of things. But I think just broad strokes, I think all those points are maybe useful for people who maybe haven't heard that framing of science and what science is really, meant to do in the first place.
I think, as you said as well, the social media aspect changed it with things like TikTok being a big one and how that content is delivered, because as you said, like someone who's watching TikTok, and spending a lot of time on it and has that kind of attention spans, probably not going to even care about a study that's maybe even coming out. So for a lot of average, just average people, uh, they're not going to. General population isn't going to, even if you have a study, or you're trying to even get any sort of point across, that they are going to respond better to that like blanket statement stuff, like, because to them it's, I've had people just say to me like, oh, this, and I'm like, where'd you get that? And they're like, oh, I just saw like a video. And I'm like, okay, but did you do anything else after that 12-second video? Like, did you Google it, or like try to look it up, or did you try to find another video on it or anything like that? But they don't. And they kind of like it. They like, and then some people will tell me something in strict confidence. Oh, did you know that? And I'm like, well, no, actually, I don't think that's the case. I'm pretty sure. And then they're like, no, 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 I saw like a guide. I'm like, but did you even go onto that person's profile to see if they're reputable, or did they quote anything? And it's interesting because TikTok changed things where YouTube it's like a long format. And that's one of the things I had a discussion with someone about, is it's like longer content form. And so people generally pay attention for longer, because if I go on YouTube, like I'll watch a 20-minute video, and I'll watch all different longer, where TikTok, it's like, you don't get the same audience. People struggle to want to sit and watch a 20-minute video. They would really rather you just kind of go like this with it and delay, just go, here's 10 seconds. And so I think that changed things a little bit. And Instagram's a weird kind of in the middle thing, because Instagram, I do feel like you can get a little bit more, at least with your videos, right? Like your videos are something that people obviously resonate with, and they can be a little bit longer because what you're saying is interesting and you're delivering information. If you were to be like, this tricep exercise is good, blah, 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 and then like finish it in 10 seconds, people wouldn't respond well. But it's because of the kind of content you're delivering. So it's an interesting one I've noticed. Like, as you've said, there's that side of it, or of where the studies aren't really being, I guess, looked at correctly. But I think there's a massive side of it of like just even being looked at, because I don't know, it's almost like there's those people that make that content talking about studies, and people, like, it's like their eyes glaze over. They're not that far interested. And this is not people that are coaches. It's just a lot of general population, but that's a part of the issue. I think the attention span side of things is big, right? I don't know if you ever look at your insights, but there's probably times where you could see on videos where, like, people watch, like on average, people watch 20 seconds and drop off, and you might watch the video back and you're like, but that 20-second mark is like right where I'm explaining something. That's the part where I explain what I did, but people drop off still. And you're like, why would you close a video if you were right at the point where someone was explaining something? So I don't know if you've noticed, or if there's a side of it for you where you've picked up on that, like it, because I mean, I'm assuming you're not on TikTok.
So I am and I'm not.
Yeah.
And what that really means is that I basically I take my reels that I make for Instagram, I copy paste, I don't even look at the app.
Yeah. Okay.
So all the content's on there, right? So people can find me, through the link in bio. Um, but no, I'm not affected. I ostensibly I'm off of TikTok at the same time that I'm on it. I don't bother to use or scroll. And I think a big part of what you're describing, I think, has a lot more to do with expectation than people realize. So, for example, if you are someone who is a content creator and most of the content you make is extremely flashy, right? So I've seen this general trend of like everything is becoming just more and more like hyper edited, right? And so the strategy there basically says, okay, people in general, their attention spans are lowering. Whether or not that's true, in terms of just trying to sort of follow along with the theme here scientifically, I don't really know. I've heard a lot of people say attention spans are shortening. I've heard a lot of people also say, and if you think about it logically, it makes sense. People are still able to watch, shows that are an hour long. Think about Game of Thrones, right? The long, slow storylines that develop with incredible amounts of complexity. And yet this is like one of the most popular shows in the last, decade or whatever. So on one hand, it's like attention spans, they're shrinking, but it's also like maybe they're not shrinking. Maybe the demand for good content is just going up. And so I think what people what people falsely assume is a drop in their audience's attention span is almost like this filtering on behalf of the content creator that gets done to the audience. So what that means is essentially like if I have a video and I notice, okay, there's a specific amount of drop off between seconds, 10 and 11 or whatever, I may in a future video potentially logically say something like, okay, well, before it was too slow. So what I need to do is I need to increase the speed of my editings. I need to increase the cuts. I need to make sure that my captions are on points and the words are bulging and the background music is at just the perfect level. And if all of these things coincide, then my, retention rate will go up. Or I could say, I'm not going to stoop down to the level of the people that don't want to watch a 20-second video. And I'm going to continue to do my own thing so that I self-select for who's actually in my audience, right? Because again, if we're optimizing for the metric of views and likes and clicks and watch time, then you're going to optimize for the people that are into polarizing content and as we're labeling, have shorter attention spans. But if you're someone who maybe wants to actually look for people who get past that 20-second mark and in fact maybe waiting for the 20-second explanation 20-second sort of time frame, then you are selecting for an audience that moving forward will continue to be watching those longer videos. So I think it's very interesting that YouTube is as popular, if not more popular than it's ever been. And at the same time, it's known as the longer format platform. But people don't go onto YouTube, on their laptops and look for videos to watch for 30 seconds, right? Unless they're just scrolling shorts or whatever, which people generally I don't think do on their laptops, at least not that I really do. They go onto YouTube to watch longer conversations. They go on to watch, interesting explanations that they, or, about things they've never learned about or whatever. And so I think it's a very interesting conversation to have because it's kind of like, which way is it really working? And as a content creator, which way do you want to encourage? And for me, I think at times there's this temptation to make the more clickable, I think, polarizing type of stuff, which I don't think is inherently bad. But I think if you end up making too much of that content in a sort of disproportionate amount, then not only does your audience come to expect that kind of content from you, but you are also contributing to the pool of people that is sort of pushing us farther in this attention deficit direction. And I think that I personally would rather be someone who is moving us away from that and maybe who is moving us more toward a world in which people are more intellectually inclined and are more intellectually interested. So I guess I'm trying to say that I'm trying to be one of those people who's maybe raising the bar for that attention span rather than contributing to continue to sort of lower it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think, as you said, if you're already trying to gain more of an audience that can enjoy the longer stuff, then you are kind of headed in the opposite direction anyway. Like you're not always going to want to make that kind of content as it feels like it doesn't feel authentic. I made one once out of like interest and I was like, I'll put this on TikTok, and I used all the AI zooms and everything like that. And I found it incoherent. Like it was like disorientating. Like I was trying to watch it back and I was like, this is like hurting my brain because it's so all over the place and it's cutting away. And I'm like, I don't know how people, but then I put it up and it got like 2,500 views in 10 minutes. And I was like, wow, it's just, you can really suck people in if it's just all over the place. And then I went, but I hated that. I didn't like it. And so I haven't made them since. I prefer something a lot more still. A lot of my, especially if it's filmed by a videographer in person and we do something in 4K or something and it looks really nice, I like how still it looks. I don't want something to zoom in and out 1,000 times. And yeah, you've obviously seen a lot of it. It's really like YouTube Shorts is hilarious for it. Like especially you'll see some YouTube channel that's not even the channel of the person, and they'll rip like Joe Rogan's podcast or Theo Von or something, and they'll just edit it themselves, and it's like all over the place, and the context is completely not even there anymore because they've cut the conversation into like it's like a 10-minute conversation they've cut into 12 seconds, and you're like, yeah, this is hard to pay attention to, and it's also once again it doesn't convey a message correctly because they've missed that point where if I give you a minute to say something, I can actually take in what you're saying and you can get across a point where even if you say it for a minute and I cut it into 12 seconds, it's going to be incredibly hard to fully get that point across, you're probably still going to look back at it and go, he cut it shorter, but I feel like
Mm,
now it sounds like I'm saying this, and I'm not.
yeah.
And but it's interesting the point you made, because I haven't had that before. You know, you're not wrong. People do watch more television shows than ever, and people binge them for hours on end. So I think, yeah, it probably just comes down to what you're making, the content you're making, and how interesting it is as well. Because I think a lot of people don't put that kind of effort in. But I know that you've done videos on Sam Sulek, and he's like an interesting one, right? Because he just like doesn't put, it's kind of what he's renowned for, right? It's like there's just not effort into it, but then he's got a ridiculous following.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I don't exactly know whether or not the Sam Sulek phenomenon is explainable at the current moment, but I think that regardless of, I don't even give a shit what the guy says or how he says it. He's moving people, I think, in a better direction than a worse direction. I don't even
mm,
care I don't necessarily on the whole think that you can generalize someone's advice as good or bad, because as we're discussing, context is the sort of king there. But I think that he is a wholly net positive for people who are trying to get into this stuff. If not only for the fact that his videos are 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes long, and there are just pretty much zero cuts, right? Just like copy paste stuff. I think it's great.
yeah, I wasn't necessarily like a massive fan to begin with, but not in any kind of way that I disliked him, which I think is probably a big part of that as well. It's really hard to dislike him because he just doesn't. I mean, that's only my experience, but I noticed the same with a lot of people. It's like he's not. He's just a chill dude, right? Who trains. So it's kind of hard. Where in the past we had a lot of more influencers who were like they had very prominent like personalities, and you could be like, oh, I hate this guy's voice. Like I'm sick of hearing it. You know, where Sam's just kind of hard to dislike, right? He's super chill guy. So I think that's a big part of it. But also, I started to come to that kind of understanding as well, because I realized there was a lot more people, like a lot more negative just coming from other people talking about it and people in comments, where his stuff, you know, and his content and who he is as a person in itself is positive. The negative stuff is really only coming from people talking about him and saying things, and obviously talking about drugs and stuff like that. I watched one of his videos and I don't feel any negativity from it, and that's a big thing when someone makes content. So, and as you said, that's what people did for a long time to get clicks, right? And that was one thing I remember with you. I remember being in the gym and someone being like, "Do you see that belt squats a trash video?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah." And that's when everyone was calling you. The last time I talked to you, and now everyone, "Oh, you're Ben Yanes," and I was like, "Yeah, that belt squash." And then you did another one, I can't remember, and people were saying it was so stupid, like, you know, and they were listing all these like good things about it and all that sort of stuff. And it's funny because it was it did what you wanted it to, right? Like it got to people, and they were like upset about it, and it was like, if you just, the content on its own was its own thing. So anything else you're bringing up is funny because you weren't not saying those things. You were making a point about what you were talking about. But people, I've noticed that people will ignore points sometimes and then start bringing up other things. But then that gets us away from here. So the argument you're trying to have, you end up having with yourself, because the video is about this and you're bringing up these things. And this person didn't even talk about these things. And I think the belt squat one was funny because we had like two at the gym. And yeah, it definitely hurt some people's feelings because they were like, I like it. And it was like, yeah. And you can continue to like it and keep on using it. And I'm sure Ben won't be bothered by it, and that's fine, you know. But you did make some good points, and with that one
Mhm.
specifically. And so the most recent stuff is the anchoring stuff, which I kind of wanted to get into because that's something I actually want to try a bit of it. There's a couple of moves that you'd done. One of them was like like an incline bench, and then you were doing. I had not seen it before. It was kind of like you were doing a curl, but your arm was like raised. You were lying on your side,
Mhm.
and then you were doing the other one I saw was, I think it was a video of someone else, and they were doing like a tricep extension, but they had their arm on like a preacher bench, and so maybe starting with the bicep curl specifically. Was there a name for that? I don't know if I caught a name.
So, I mean, I think that regardless of the specific variation, it's important to maybe just define, from a principle-based standpoint, like what we're really talking about. Because I think that, regardless of the name that you give, you could just describe the joint position, or you could call it, something silly. You could start calling it the honest curl, which would be absolutely hilarious. Which I would not advise that anyone would ever do, but it's a thing that happens. So no, so in terms of like anchoring and really what it is and why it's important, first thing is it's by no stretch of the imagination a new concept, right? Like as long as lifting has been around, anchoring has been a thing. I just kind of gave it that name because it's sticky. People, I think, like names for things, and it's something that I think, from a branding standpoint, again, if anyone listening is in content creation, I think it's good to start to associate certain things that are, well, I guess the same but new with your brand, right? So instead of calling it like external stability principles of training, right? You just say anchoring, right? And anchors and describing anchoring, it becomes, I think, much more intuitive for people even who don't know what it is. So I think broadly speaking, what people will identify the principle with being is just using external support to accomplish things. And there's been, for as long as I've been in the industry, this very weird sort of energy around using things that are not our bodies to perform exercise, right? So a good example might be like, and this is the one that I'll use moving forward to kind of just put layers onto the same exercise here. If you're doing a curl, let's say, and you're doing it on a cable machine, and let's say you step, 3 steps ahead of the cable machine, so now the cables are pulling your arms backward and also downward. You're in a position where you can do a curl for sure, but people, for some reason, think that in that particular case, putting something behind your arm to prevent your upper arm from moving is somehow bad or worse, or would make the exercise less functional. And I think to sort of just demystify that conversation is very important. It's kind of the same conversation around how people will say back squats are the best because like they're more functional, and hack squats and leg press, they're just easy, and they're stupid and non-functional because you have all this external support. And it's like, if you were to really just break this thing down to its fundamental units, all you would be able to see, and you'll see a lot of this, with the RTS stuff specifically, is just um, different points of contact for force and directions of force. And you can look at every single exercise through that lens, right? You can look at it through the lens of force, which we, in terms of like our experience of it, could just call resistance, like resistance training, and just the position of the body and where the body is in relationship to the resistance. And so when you just start to think about every single exercise as this relationship between resistance and your body, right? This relationship between your body moving around in space and different forces being imparted on our body, then all the stupid conversations about is this more or less functional just become much more mathematical and move in the direction of just, okay, what are the objective qualities of this exercise and what is it better for, and maybe what is it not as good for, right? You don't see very many super high level bodybuilders doing back squats twice a week, right? What you see them doing is you see them doing a lot of machine based work. And because bodybuilders become massive and heavy and they lose a ton of mobility as a consequence of that, people just associate machine based training with lacking function and mobility, which is the stupidest thing that I've ever heard. So anyway, to not maybe go too far in that direction, the reason that this concept of anchoring is important is because it essentially limits movement options, right? So what that means is, in the case of the face away curl that we started with, if I were to, again, do the curl and step away from the machine, hopefully everyone can sort of visualize you stepping forward and the cable is now pulling your arms backward. What may happen as soon as you start to initiate that curl is there will be twice the amount of at least torque on your shoulder as your elbow. Why? Because the direction of the resistance is twice as far generally from your shoulder as your elbow. So if you're trying to, with a curl, accomplish the goal of growing curling muscles, right? Your biceps, your brachialis, your brachioradialis, um, why would you choose to do an exercise that might not make that group of muscles the rate limiter of the motion? So for the same reason that you might put something behind your upper arm in a preacher curl with a dumbbell, you might want to find a way to put something behind your arm in the case of the cable curl so that you're not trying to resist a ton of motion at the shoulder in relationship to the elbow. So if you could sort of summarize, like, why is that principle important? It's important because it moves us in the direction of being more precise with our exercise selection and execution. And it moves us away from not really being exactly sure what we're trying to do. And it moves us away from recruiting a bunch of shit that we don't necessarily want to recruit and stress. And people think that this stuff is sort of like, or talking about this stuff is majoring in the minors, right? But at what point do you start to draw a line of importance around these kinds of topics, right? Because it's not just the single rep that we're looking at, right? It's not 2 reps. It's not 1 set. It's not a host of sets. It's just the amalgamation of all these things. And if you get to a point where half of the exercises you're doing are like full body compound exercises, you end up with a whole program that's basically just like most of your exercise are fatiguing, maybe 60 to 70% of the target tissue, and then 30 to 40% of completely non-related, non-targeted tissues. And that sort of effect adds up in terms of its volume over time. And I think a lot of people realize that, which is why I think a lot of more advanced people move in the direction of more machine-based, cable-based, dumbbell-based stuff, as opposed to what I think many people traditionally used to. So to kind of bring that home, I think using external support and using anchoring is important, because it allows for all of the things that we want to do, I think, more specifically, and it sort of prevents us maybe from accumulating specific kinds of fatigue and stress in the areas that we don't want, right? And there are obviously a lot of principles that sort of need to underlie that in terms of understanding the basic physics. But the, example of the curl and, a preacher curl is maybe a better visual for people to know intuitively. The reason you put the pad underneath of your arm as opposed to on top of your arm, right? That is something that may be obvious to people, but that is sort of in a principle-based way, something that you can understand when you dive a little bit more deeply into this stuff. So yeah, it's a very fun concept to me because, you can play around with it a lot, and, it's depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what muscle groups you're trying to train, it may look very different. And, the fun thing about it to me is that it's it's something that applies across a multitude of scenarios, right? And that's, I think, really how you identify something that is principle based as opposed to something that is a soundbite and something that is just sort of a snippet that, someone has taken and posted on social media. Is if you can go to a gym you've never been to and problem solve, for a solution that, maybe you had to sort of work around because you understand these kinds of things at a principle based level. That's something that's really cool to me. And being able to teach, trainers how to teach their clients that is something that has been exciting to see too, along this process of just, teaching people about this principle specifically, and obviously others that are sort of related. So I'll end my spiel there, but maybe I could be a bit more specific about anything if it was unclear.
No, you made a lot of good points, and the last bit specifically is something that I resonate with personally because I've worked in a few different gyms. I worked in a gym where we were very limited, and I got thrown in the kind of deep end with like do what you can. It's probably the best thing for me as a coach initially because I just ended up having to come up with things and learn more because I would have kind of drowned otherwise, right? Like I would have had people kind of being like, even though they were general population, maybe wouldn't understand certain things, they would probably still start to ask like, maybe there'd be a lack of variety, or there would be something that wasn't necessarily working for them as an exercise, but I wouldn't be able to explain it. And so there was almost like a pressure initially. And I was like, oh, I need to learn everything. I need to watch everything. And so I understand this because if someone, it was weird. It was almost like an anxiety. If someone asked me, I need to be able to explain this. And then I weirdly ended up being interested and then learning because I wanted to, but it started as that, which is funny, I think. But the point that you made is a good one because a good coach should be able to create a program even if someone has limiting factors. I trained a lot of people who worked away, here or something, and they'll work at like a site that has like I've seen gyms where they'll send me a video and it will be like carpet, an exercise bike, a couple of dumbbells. And I'm like, there's not even a cable machine. Oof, that's tough, but I've made it work with people, and it is a difficult thing. But as you said, if you understand how the body works, then it's going to carry over. And there is that kind of level, I think, with people, as you said, where why would you not want to do something better if you can? Like, why would I want to do, like, if I'm like, oh, I want to grow my quads, like, why would I barbell squat if there's a hack squat right next to me, or there's a pendulum squat right next to me? If I'm specifically wanting to grow my quads, why would I do something that's going to ask me to do 100 other things? And it makes sense, but I think, and this is where I kind of wanted to ask you about it, I think progressive overload comes into it. Personally, I find with people, because it's almost like a simplicity. So people are like, yeah, but barbell squat, I put more weight on. Cable machine, I get to weight and can't move past. Right. And so I'm kind of making someone sound like an idiot, but that's probably how I thought when I started. But it's almost a bit like that. They're like, yeah, but a barbell squat, I just add a little bit of weight to, or I can do a rep. But for some reason, I think cable machines, people constantly hit these like plateaus with them. And I'm sure you've had people say it to you, oh, I'm doing lat raises, but I get to like, and they're always really weird on cable machines, right? It'll be like 13.5 kilos or something, or you would say it in pounds. And people will go, I just can't get past it. And I think with barbells, people almost have this kind of like more simplistic approach where they feel like they can infinitely add a kilo or two or 5 pounds, and that kind of works in their head a little bit better. I've definitely had clients where it's just, or they'll get to a cable machine and 2 weeks in a row, I'm like, oh, you've not, can we add a rep? Oh, no, I just don't feel like I can add anything. So I think there's that kind of level of like, obviously when you do a preacher curl, say you're doing a single arm preacher curl, that is quite a difficult exercise that you're not going to be able to use a ton of weight on. Is there an approach that you'd sort of take with people to try to help people still progressively overload on these exercises?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I want to give an analogy, and I really want the analogy to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense to you, you got to tell me, on the spot. I won't be embarrassed. Okay.
Okay.
The, so,
Just
okay.
just
So,
just before you do that, this is
yes.
totally unrelated, but I'm just going to quickly have a drink of this water that I'm definitely, it's just water, just completely
Yeah. Look,
unrelated.
I don't know. It says thirst trap.
Oh, what was that? What did it say? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm not gonna, but I'm
It
gonna
said,
loop
yeah,
that.
it said
Loop
thirst
that.
trap.
It's like Liquid Death, but it's our
Right.
version. It's down under.
It's funny. It's funny. I thought it was liquid death when you pulled it up. That's funny. Um, okay. So I think a lot of, we can get to talking about like load in a second, sort of secondarily. But if we want to give a good analogy for understanding why, let's to use two examples, the barbell bench press, people can, progressive overload, I can put a little bit of weight on there versus the dumbbell lateral raise or the cable lateral raise, which for some reason, seems to, that doesn't seem to be the case on those exercises. If you picture two scenarios, picture you have a shot glass, right? So however many ounces a shot is, pretty tiny, right? Fits in, you could fit like 3 of them on your palm, probably. And you picture a bucket, like one of those Home Depot. I don't know if you have Home Depot over there in, Perth or anything. I'm assuming you do, but you have like one of those Home Depot 5-gallon buckets. Yeah, just in terms of like other parts of the world, I'm like, is there McDonald's? Probably. I
We
don't. It's
we have McDonald's, but it's our Home Depot's called Bunnings, and the floor's made of concrete, and it's really cold. And when your parents would take you there as a kid, you would hate it the entire time. But they make sausage sizzles out the front, and they're really shitty, badly made sausage sizzles, but you enjoy them. So there's a little bit
okay.
of culture.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, maybe if I ever get out there, I'll explore that. But
Absolutely.
okay, so picture you have a shot glass, right? If any of you are underage, please be responsible. And then you have the 5-gallon bucket right next to it, right? If someone were to ask you um how many times you could just fill a little bit of water in each of those things, you would have a much easier and longer time frame within which you could fill that larger bucket, right? As compared to the shot glass, right? You have a very small, again, I think it's like 2 ounces, maybe it's 1 ounce, so probably a 1 ounce shot glass versus a 5-gallon, bucket. That's the comparison if anyone wants to Google this. The point just being that it's a lot easier to add small increments in the larger bucket just because of the obvious fact that the bucket is 1,000 times the size, right? So In the same way, if you are using an exercise, which is a bench press, which has a much higher loading potential than a lateral raise, how much can you lateral raise like one rep for? Like, who knows? Like, people can't even probably raise, most people probably can't even raise a 40-pound dumbbell past like, halfway up. So if you're doing an exercise where your potential capacity for a 1 rep max is, we'll say, 150 kilos to use your language, 330 pounds to use mine, and then you're over here on this other end of the gym and you're doing an exercise where maybe you're doing reps with like 15 or 10-pound dumbbells, or, so 5 to 10 kilos dumbbells, right? You have a much larger buffer with the one that has a lot more absolute load, right? Every single increment that you put on the bench press is a fraction of the percentage of load that you put onto the dumbbell or that you put onto the cable. Now, unfortunately, with the dumbbell, most dumbbells don't come with like these little micro gains, little plates that we actually have in my gym, where you can tack on a little 1.5-pound plate or a 0.75-pound plate, and you can do the same sort of on the cable stack with that trick where you put the cable in, you put the plate over the little, the whatever that's called, the thing that you stick inside of the cable stack, right? So it's essentially, it has nothing necessarily to do with the properties of the exercise, other than the fact that in one instance, you have the very small shot glass, and in the other instance, you have this massive 5-gallon bucket, right? It's much easier to add increments to the 5-gallon bucket because you have so much more room and surface area as compared to this tiny, tiny thing where you add one little drop and it's like the cup is, halfway full. And so what people falsely assume is that there's a problem with the exercisers, there's a problem with the progression model, when in reality, there's an issue with the paradigm and the math that people are doing. So if you're repping out, 225 for 10 reps on a bench press, you can add a 2.5 and that'll be 1% of the load, that you're using on the exercise. But if you go from, the 10-pound dumbbells to the 15-pound dumbbells, all of a sudden you've added 50 times the amount of load that you did in relationship to the bench. So I think just overall, the important idea to remember is the concept of absolute load and how it actually does matter, but that it's not a specific property of a barbell bench press or of a barbell back squat or a barbell deadlift that makes those things special. It's merely just the absolute number that you're dealing with. And so when you get to the point of, okay, this dumbbell preacher, I can't progress it, or this cable lateral, I can't progress it, you have to do one of a couple of things. You either have to change your paradigm in terms of how much load you're adding to begin with, which again, in most cases, you need to have access, in the case of a dumbbell, to like one of those little micro plates that you tack onto the dumbbell. You can get those on Amazon. You can get a pair that's like 0.75 pounds and 1.25 pounds and 1.5 pounds. Or in the case of, a cable, you could do any number of things. You could add that like a plate to the pin. Like I said earlier, you could, if any people are watching, you put a weight here and, you put it into the stack and the weight is hanging on that pin. You could add more reps. You could also add more reps in the case of a dumbbell lateral raise. You could potentially do more volume. You could potentially, this is a fun one. In the case of a cable lateral raise, instead of holding the handle in your hand, you could actually loop the strap around your wrist, right, to make it slightly lighter. So maybe that allows for a different kind of progression that you can then sort of work past, right? There are just a ton of creative ways that you can work around what we all perceive to be this roadblock with the exercise that, again, to me, have nothing to do directly with the exercise, but rather just the absolute, amount of load that we're able to use on each of them. Did that make sense to you specifically, that line of thinking? Okay, because I wanted to just say one more thing, which is this concept of load and how what we experience in the gym is not the weight that we see on the implement. And this will be, a very familiar concept to anyone who's, taken any, serious course out there in relationship to exercise mechanics. But this concept of torque, I think, is weirdly not really talked about, which is basically a torque. If any of you haven't heard the term, is basically a term that refers to resistance. That's how you can think of it. Because resistance, in terms of, our ability to move resistance, is not just, the weight on the dumbbell or the weight on the cable stack or the plates that we put on. It's that amount of force times the distance to our joints, right? So if anyone can picture a dumbbell lateral raise is much easier at the bottom, right? You can probably lift a ton of more weight at the bottom as compared to the top. But in the case of a dumbbell lateral raise, it's not like if you're holding a 10-pound dumbbell, that 10-pound dumbbell is all of a sudden changing its load in and of itself. It's not just becoming 20 pounds, right? But it is moving a lot farther away from you. So torque, and when we say resistance, is really this relationship between the absolute load that you're holding, whether it's a barbell, like it doesn't matter the exercise, and its distance from our joints and how our joints are moving. And so, generally speaking, when things are farther away from us, they apply more resistance to us. And when things are closer to us, they apply less resistance. And so, if all you're looking at and all you're measuring is what is the weight on the dumbbell or what is the weight on the barbell that I'm using, you hear people say this all the time. Oh, I can bench 225, but then when I go to the cable stack, I'm only pressing, whatever 110 on the cables, or maybe it's a 1-to-1 and it's a lower amount, right? So I think people get very wrapped up in just what is the number without recognizing that that number has to be involved with some amount of distance. And that distance is a relationship that has its potential to change at any point throughout a range of motion in any exercise that you're doing. And it has the potential to change between people. Like, why do people with much shorter arms on average bench a lot more weight? Right? It's because the resistance is literally much closer to their bodies, right? In other words, the resistance is actually lower. So for someone who has, let's say, just at an extreme, let's say someone had half the amount of length in their humerus, right, in the bottom position compared to me, they would literally be experiencing half the amount of resistance in that particular position if we were to sort of do a freeze frame. There are other things that could be involved there, right, in that position. So we often sort of glorify people who can lift a lot of weight, right, without recognizing that weight is merely just a consequence of all these things that are occurring in tandem and that sort of have a very intimate relationship with one another. And if you change any one of those variables, right, if you change the distance, if you change the angle of your arm, if you change the tempo, if you change even just the specific implement, whether it's cable or dumbbell, all of a sudden now you're dealing with completely different situations that are not to be compared or shouldn't be compared in any sort of realistic one-to-one sort of a way. So I know that was a little bit tangential, but I thought it was an important point to make, which is just that resistance is not the load that we see. It's a lot of other things too, which are, related to distance and also motion, obviously. And that's where things get a little bit more complicated in terms of comparing exercises.
It's an interesting one because I had this conversation the other day, and it was because we were talking about an exercise and then moved on to machines. So we were talking about machines and just like the different manufacturers and things like that. And in the course, Mark Slaveman did bring it up. So he was talking about like how I don't know where they hold them, someplace in America where they, companies will all go there and you can all look at different new machines that they've created and ask questions about the design choices and things like that. And so we found it interesting because when I went to Melbourne, I met up with someone there that I knew, and he was using a T-bar row. Not while I was there, but we went to the same gym, and then he had a video of him using it, and I hadn't seen it before. So it was a T-bar row, but for whatever reason, people are going to be listening to this, but they can see it if they're watching it on Spotify. But it had the end on it like it normally would, but for whatever reason, the weight wasn't loaded until maybe, I would honestly say, I don't know if this is the right system for you. I was going to say half a meter, but I don't know how to. I don't
It's
know.
fine. I can picture a meter stick in my head.
Yeah. So that's pretty much like I'd never seen it. It's weird to never see things when you've never seen something and you see it at a gym randomly. You're like, why have I never seen that? And so he was lifting 3 plates on the end of it or something like that. And he's a strong guy. And I was like, that looks really hard. And he was like, yeah, it's really hard. Like the weight's further away from you and you can feel it. Like it definitely feels a lot harder. And I was like, I'd like to try that at some point. And then I had a conversation with Tim here the other day, and I said, it's interesting though, because as you explain things, wouldn't it be better if everything was further away from us to an extent, right? Kind of, not really, but sort of. In my head, I'm like, if it's further away and then it becomes heavier, if it was further away all the time in most, you can't always do it, but if you did it in a lot of exercises or most of them, wouldn't that be better? Because then I wouldn't have to lift as much weight. but I know there's a little bit more to it than that. But it was interesting to hear you explore it and the way you explained it, because a lot of machines aren't created like that. And there's some machines, especially the ones here, maybe not in our gym, but we have golds here as well. And some of them are created to make it a lot easier. As you explained with the lateral raise, we had a machine there where the pad was here. So rather than it being out in where my hand would be, it was
Mm-hmm.
like right here. So the resistance was like right next to me. So you could do 50 kilos on it, right? And it was like, I shouldn't be able to do this much weight on this exercise. And so and personally, I didn't find it very comfortable for my shoulders. But that's kind of what you're talking about. Obviously, the design choices on some machines make it easier for us. And to an extent, I guess sometimes I think, is that what we want?
So that's a great. I'm gonna kind of go off on a little thing here, okay, to dive into what you just said.
Great.
Because so the first thing is that when we're talking about resistance, right, as I mentioned, we're talking about torque, and really, again, torque is this product of force and a particular distance. And so we don't need to get into units of measurement. I don't think that's important. It's basically like, both a unit of weight and a distance. So you could say foot pounds or whatever, your translation would be. Um, but basically, if we look at, that kind of example that you were describing, like the T-bar, which has the much longer lever versus the one that is more, like the weight is basically right in front of the handles or next to the handles, you would have to stack more weight on the one that is the lever that's shorter, because it would be applying less resistance to you, right? And as you're saying, the longer lever one, you can use less resistance, added resistance on, and that would be, you could almost do something called torque equating, which is basically like if you were to double the length of the lever, right, you could use half the weight. Or if you cut the lever in half, you could use twice the amount of weight, right? So that's a good sort of example to, relay to that. What I was talking about the bench press, where if you had half the length of a humerus in that one position, you could theoretically be resisting half that amount. But anyway, the question is kind of like, wouldn't we always want the longer lever because then we could use less load? I would say the reason that I would say no to that is because there are a lot of influences in an exercise that don't necessarily have to do directly with torque. Okay. So if we look at the longer lever situation and the shorter lever situation, sure, we could torque equate. But the problem with that is that, and I'm sure anyone who is longer limbed, this is something that they experience but can't necessarily describe, is that longer levers move much longer distances. And for anyone who is listening at home, what you can do as a little experiment is you can use like a pen and a piece of paper, and you can take that pen and essentially just draw a straight line down that's maybe the full length of the page. So if anyone is watching, what that would maybe look like, and if any of you aren't watching, you should just at this point watch. You could, if you're looking at me, you could literally just draw a straight line down on the page like that, just boom, straight down the middle. And then you could sort of imagine a halfway mark of that line. And you could picture, okay, if something were the full length of this page, right, we'll call it like this, and it moved, we'll say 45 degrees this way. And again, this is going to be really unfortunate for anyone listening. But if you've had the visual on Spotify, why not? Just click the thing. If you had this length of a lever and it moves 45 degrees, it's going to move a certain distance, right? But then if you took a lever that was half that length, which is now being represented by my finger for those watching, and you also moved it 45 degrees, it would actually move as a proportion a lot less distance horizontally. Okay. So what that means is that if you had half of the lever length, right, but the same amount of resistance or the same amount of torque, it would still move that shorter lever. It would still move a much shorter distance. Okay. A good way to relate this to the exercise experience is if you are using a cable stack. You ever use a cable stack that just feels like super heavy? And you ever just use one that feels like super smooth and light? The one that feels super smooth and light, the reason it feels that way is because the weight on the stack is moving a lot less, right? So you could theoretically pin the exact same amount of platage, right, or of load on the stack. And if it's moving a much smaller amount per the amount that the cable moves, it will feel like a lot smoother of an experience. And the reason that has to do with this concept called inertia, which many people have probably heard. Inertia is essentially just something that describes resistance to change. And I think this is probably getting a little bit like esoteric for people. But the sort of oversimplified takeaway is that, yeah, you could equate for resistance. So you could use the longer lever and you could use a lot less external load, but that longer lever is moving a much greater distance in a specific direction that may actually not benefit the exercise. So let's go back to the example of the T-bar row. If that lever is moving, a lot longer distance, what that means is essentially the weight is traveling pretty much a lot more straight up and down, as opposed to those shorter T-bar rows, which if you've noticed, like toward the end of the rep, you notice how they maybe start kind of closer to parallel to the floor, and then they almost tip backward to where they're more vertical to the ground. That tipping backward happens because that lever is shorter, right? Because the one that's much longer, it could move the same amount of degrees, but it's still moving really, really vertically. And it stays very, very closer to parallel to the floor. And so the reason that you may actually want the shorter lever T-bar row is because the angle of the whole thing actually changes substantially, which is actually much more aligned with our ability to pull. So most exercises, in terms of like, now we're getting into resistance profile, strength profile, all these sort of jargony terms, you could basically just think of it as like certain exercises in terms of resistance change when we move through a range of motion. So I gave the example earlier in the podcast of the dumbbell lateral and how the dumbbell is much heavier when I'm holding it out to my side as compared to when I'm holding it next to me. But the problem with that is I'm actually much weaker mechanically when my arm is at the top of the range. So you're choosing an exercise, if you're doing it in that standard way, where the resistance is heaviest at the top, but you're weakest at the top. You're actually strongest at the bottom, where the resistance is actually a lot lighter. So in the example of the T-bar row, to sort of wind this long, convoluted explanation up, in the example of a T-bar row, the shorter lever version, I think, is personally more appropriate to matching the mechanics of our pulling tissues, because as it moves more vertical to the floor, it actually gets lighter. And so when you have a really, really long T-bar and it moves a really great distance, pretty much just vertically, it doesn't get really lighter at all. And so what you end up doing is you end up having to either do a ton of partials in the bottom, which could be fine. Partials are cool. But you do sort of end up with this mismatched situation where, like in the dumbbell lateral raise, in the bottom of the motion, you're super strong, but it gets much harder as you go, because not only does the resistance continue to increase in the case of the dumbbell lateral, but you also get weaker. And so I think the takeaway from that is, no, we would not always want longer levers. And that is one of the multiple reasons why. Another sort of, it's not exactly the same, but another reason is just this whole conversation around inertia and how, some cable stacks feel really heavy and others feel much lighter and smoother. The version that feels much lighter and smoother feels that way because it's sort of the cable stack equivalent of the shorter lever, if that makes sense. And the longer lever equivalent of the cable stack is the one that feels much heavier and much more jerky. And so, like I said, hopefully that was at least relatively understandable. And I think the important takeaway is that, yeah, we can have this conversation about torque, but there are all these other things to consider, like the length of a lever, as we just discussed, and how that sort of interacts with torque. And this is sort of what I was trying to allude to earlier with just the interaction of variables and how complex it can get when we just sort of generalize statements, and how in the name of science, I think it's best to, on a case-by-case basis, define these things, as opposed to just trying to sort of broad strokes slap a label onto something, right? Because in the case of, one exercise, the longer lever situation may be awesome. And another exercise, it may feel like total shit. And I think a lot of people experience that, with that sort of heavy feeling cable stack. And a lot of these things can kind of explain those more specific questions if we just sort of zoom back out to these sort of first principles of, torque and inertia and lever lengths, arcs of motion, all those things kind of together. So I don't know if that was totally confusing and off the rails, or at least somewhere landing for some people. But let me know.
Well, I for one am proud of myself because I understood it, and I was worried for a moment that I would get lost, but I was able to follow what you were saying. And so once again, people have full access to the video on Spotify when this comes out. So just if when you needed to have a visual, maybe not if you're driving, but if you have the ability to have a look, then do so, because that helped as well. And I think the way, even just when you talked about the degree changing and everything, that was something I haven't heard a lot about before, and that definitely, yeah, helped.
Can I give one, just one anecdote from a visual perspective that I've been wanting to use as an anecdote forever? Is a really good way to simplify this concept of the lever lengths and how the shorter ones move a shorter distance for the same degree of angle change. If you ever have used a laser pointer, okay, I don't know how many people are going to have laser pointers in their house. Stand really close next to a wall and point it at the wall and move it like 45 degrees, right? And then take one step backward and move it 45 degrees. And you'll notice how much farther the dot moves compared to that first thing where you were much closer to the wall. So you being right next to the wall and just sort of moving it up and down, that's that short lever situation. And all you're doing is just lengthening the lever by moving your hand away from the wall. And again, if you move that same 45 degrees, that distance is going to exponentially increase. So if anyone has a laser pointer, if you have a cat, you should have a laser pointer probably. So go get the laser pointer, stand close to the wall, and just sort of, just move your hand just a little bit, and you'll notice the dot just sort of barely is like pulsing up and down. Take one step back and just do that sort of wiggle thing, and you'll notice how much more that distance opens up. That's a really good way to think about the difference in terms of, two levers, they can move exactly the same amount of degrees, but in reality, at least the end point of the lever is drastically different in terms of how much it moves. And again, this is what people who are unfortunately long-limbed are describing when they're like, squatting feels horrible. It's just like there's so much motion forward and backward. There's so much change of direction of their limbs in terms of how they're moving through space versus Tom Platz, who can't understand why anyone in the world wouldn't want to squat, because I have femurs that are 1 foot long and I can just go up and down like I'm in a piston, And so that's also something that I've been thinking about, is trying to articulate that, and why that opinion is a silly opinion to have about the back squats, but I'll hand it back to you in terms of where you want to take things from there.
Well, first of all, I like I like that we got to hear that for the first time. I can make that a little snippet as well, because I thought that was a good explanation. And I don't know what it's like
Okay.
over there, but we sell, ironically, in our shops here, we've got cats and then laser pointers strategically right next to them. So that's, and they're usually
Great.
both in stock. So it's good. But that anyone out there that has a laser pointer, you can try that. I'm going to, just funny because you brought up Tom, give a shout out to one of my co-hosts, Connor, because he went on a bit of a rant yesterday on Instagram about how, and I didn't know this, but apparently there's a whole thing behind people thinking this and everything, about Tom Platt's record, where he squatted, it was like 525 for 23. And I didn't realize there's like a whole group of people that actually think it's complete bullshit and have done extensive videos on it about how it was fake. And Connor thinks it's fake as well. So I don't know that I'll ever concern myself with it, but it was funny to hear him say it, and he could be right. But if you want to, message Connor and ask him about it, because he was happy to talk to me about how fake it looked and all these different variables. I just thought it was funny. It was something I never considered with Tom Platz, because it just seems like a weird thing to do. Why would you fake it? But it was hilarious to hear like almost like a flat Earth kind of like theory behind Tom Platz faking his squat. uh, but Tom, that's an interesting one, because I know you've done videos before. You've used Tom, like, as examples, or like a cutaway or something, and people have now. A lot of people have done it, and it's an interesting thing because, as you said, it's once again just someone being shorter or having that shorter leverage and being biased about how they explain something. Where I don't know how tall you are personally. I'm 6'2". I don't know what you guys, that's your language, right? You guys use inches. So over here, I think I would say centimeters, but we never say centimeters here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm about 6 foot.
Yeah. So I think anything over 6 foot, depending, I mean, you might still be really short limbed, but if you're over 6 foot and you had short limbs, it might look a bit weird. But when I squat, yeah, it's especially if it's low bar or something, I can fold over, and I can find it personally. I find squatting fairly comfortable, but at the same time, it took a long time for me to feel comfortable doing it, and weirdly like high bar or something, even though it's okay, feels worse because once again, because of the positioning, and I am trying to stay more upright, my body doesn't really want me to, and I don't have short femurs. Everything's just long. Like I'm built like a swimmer, so trying to be a bodybuilder is really hard. But we have a pendulum squat here, and I know there's been a bit
Mm.
of a rise in their popularity, and this is one of the only ones in like our area because they're really not common at gyms here for whatever reason. And I thought they would be an interesting one to touch on because we've been obviously talking about, I guess, a few upper body exercises, and when we did mention a few other ones, but they're obviously like a kind of an ego destroyer at the moment, I think, because people are getting on them and realizing, oh wow, I can't use anywhere near the amount of weight that I can on a hack squat or a leg press. Do
Yeah.
you have like a pendulum squat at the gym that you're at? Do you use them often?
Yeah, so we have the Atlantis one. I've also used the Predator one, I think it's called, that Cass has. I've used the Arsenal one. So I've used a bunch of them. The one we have is Atlantis, so that's the one I have the most experience with. But I think that's a really, really good exercise to bring up as a part of this conversation because it's like, well, why can't I use, as much load as I would put on a back squat? And interestingly enough, there are a number of factors that are involved, I think, in this equation. And one of the biggest ones, or two of the biggest ones, one is the length of just the lever of the pendulum, right? It's really freaking long, right? Relative to, think of any other machine like a leg press that you use, like the levers that you see are usually a much shorter length. And that's what makes it the pendulum squat, right? That's what allows it to swing in the way that it does. But the other thing that I think is maybe almost uh, more resistance magnifying than that is specifically the direction that the machine forces you to move. So if anyone doesn't know what a pendulum squat is or have one, just very briefly, like look it up and just look how it moves because it's going to be annoying to describe. But it's basically like you have a back pad, you have, shoulder pads, and it basically, you go down and it kind of swings forward as, the name indicates in a pendulum squat. And what this basically allows for is it allows for a squat that is not really only a squat, but it's a squat that from a force perspective is also a leg extension. So a teaching tool that I really like in a lot of cases to talk about this concept of friction. I think everyone knows the word friction and is familiar with it to a vague degree. Um, but if you imagine your feet in that scenario on the pendulum squat to be on top of a sheet of ice, right? So the platform, instead of having this nice rubbery surface, is a sheet of ice. What would happen pretty much immediately, and if it didn't happen immediately, it would start to happen immediately as soon as you were to descend, is your feet would slide up the platform. Like you would just slip, your feet would slide up toward the ceiling, and you would just fall directly downward. And so what friction does is friction prevents your feet from sliding up. So in essence, what the friction of the foot plate does is it creates a force that wants to sort of push your feet downward, right? It's weird to conceptualize because your feet aren't moving, but the point is that there's a tremendous amount of frictional force involved because of the direction that the pendulum is arcing, meaning it's not just going downward like a hack squat, it's going downward and forward. So it's kind of shoving your butt to your heels. Because that direction becomes very horizontal, you're not only pushing downward through the floor, you're also pushing upward at the same time. Because if you don't push upward, it's either going to feel really weird or you're not going to really be able to move any sort of load in the horizontal direction, right? Because to push backward, you have to push forward. So it's a really good. The reason I say it's a good example to bring up is because a lot of the things that create this outcome of how much resistance we put on the machine are not easily identifiable, right? Like most people would just look at that machine and be like, well, this looks and feels the same as like a hack squat, or it looks the same as like a regular squat. But the forces are so drastically different in terms of, that frictional element and the direction that the pendulum is actually moving, that you have a ton of magnified load in the bottom where most people intuitively think, oh, okay, the lever is actually getting closer to the axis, so it should be getting lighter, right? The bottom of the pendulum squat is actually the point at which you have to create the most amount of muscular torque to get back up out of the, the bottom position, or out of just, the eccentric portion of the motion. So that is one that is basically like, are there hip tissues involved in the contraction? Absolutely. Do your glutes get on board? Do your adductors get on board? Yes. But much more secondarily, or even we'll say less involved in secondarily, as compared to something like a hack squat, right? And that's, again, specifically because of that frictional thing and you having to sort of resist something that's more horizontal, in addition to the fact that you're getting smushed down by a pad. So again, it basically just ends up feeling like it's both the force of a regular squat and of a leg extension. And the fact that both of those things are combined essentially magnifies the torque on you in the bottom position to such a great degree that you don't really need very much external load that you slap onto the plate. So, again, a lot of people will look at someone doing that for the first time and it's like, oh, I only have one plate and a 25, or 2 plates, right? And I'm like dying here. And it's because they've just never done an exercise that has that sort of combination of leg extension and squat forces that makes that so much more difficult to deal with. So I think that's a really good example to illustrate how the external loading has something to do with the resistance, but certainly not everything. In fact, in this case, I would argue that it has a lot less to do with our experience of the exercise as compared to something like, a barbell squat, even, where the loading is, we don't have to worry about a ton of the, forward to backward forces. So hopefully that wasn't too convoluted, but I think that it's a great, exercise for some people that can fit into, the machines well. I think some people get into that thing and it's like, for whatever reason, the relative proportions of their limb length just don't feel good. I've had some people who just, regardless of the setup we do, just get sort of, pinned about halfway down with dorsiflexion range. And it's like, even if we use a heel elevation and we make all the adjustments that we need to, it just doesn't quite feel right. And I think that maybe points to something interesting, which is that any kind of machine that is more sort of functioning in an arc, I think is going to fit fewer people well, right? So the more, in essence, that the direction of a machine changes within a given exercise, at least in the context of like a compound motion, right? Because leg extension, leg curl, it's easier to adjust. But if you're moving both hips and knees and ankles all at the same time, and you're trying to sort of coordinate that with that pendulum arcing motion, I think it can be very complicated for people to, feel okay sort of doing that kind of thing. And although, pendulum squats between brands can be different, I find that the majority of them feel relatively similar, apart from maybe one or two, which are just total crap. I can't remember the brand name of it now. But I think it's a great, it has a great place in a program where someone feels competent in being able to do that kind of thing. It feels good in terms of the knee forces, because those are going to be magnified like hell. And if you, haven't used it before and you're thinking about it, just make sure that, especially, if you've had prior knee issues, patellofemoral related problems, that you just be careful with how much you load it initially. And just like anything else, progress it. It's not a dangerous exercise inherently, but it is an exercise where people, even more so than a back squat, really want to avoid the bottom portion of the motion because of how hard it is. And then the people that avoid the bottom of the motion and like really sink into it, or sink in and bounce out of it, they say that the bottom is the easiest and the top is harder. When in reality, mechanically, if you're actually to remain controlled in the motion, like I said, the bottom is just basically a bottomless pit of hell for your quads. So yeah, I think it has a place, but not for everyone, just like anything else. And I personally use it, every single week, just because I have one and I like it. So, no harm in trying and just kind of seeing how it fits, and, playing around with it and kind of seeing how it interacts with your anatomy and all those things.
Yeah, I think, as you kind of covered it before with the leverage side of things, it's interesting when it comes to movement, because, as you said, that was a good example. But as we've been talking about it, it's made me think about, probably about maybe 10 months ago, I started jujitsu as a hobby. And one of the things I noticed was my prior knowledge of the body and understanding it helped a bit. And it helped me understand things when it came to just them even explaining something. So just something as simple as what we're talking about. If I was there last night and I was getting pummeled by like a dude who was like 120, it sucked. And I had my arm on the ground here. He was trying to get one of my arms. Kind of as you mentioned, he was on top of me slightly to the right and then pinning my wrist down with his arm, right? And his arm was almost straight because of the position that he was in, but my arm was stretched out completely. And he was doing that on purpose, right? He was like, I want your arm to be out here, and then I'm putting all my pressure on it. It then became obviously almost impossible for me to try and get my arm back because I'm essentially having to, well, do like a fly with his whole body weight that he's putting on my arm. And when you put it into that perspective, it's even more interesting because then it makes me realize one of the biggest things now, and it pisses people off, but defense is what I put a lot of focus on. So the constant go to is I keep my arms in here, right? Or anything. I always want to try to stay everything close because
Yeah.
if I'm here and then someone grabs my arm, it doesn't take as much for me to bring my shoulder down or try to get my hand back. Going out here is the last thing that I want to do now because as soon as someone has that ability, obviously you put yourself in a position for an armbar or something, but what we're talking about applies to movement. And we don't generally think that with exercise. Like exercise is sometimes like it sounds like it's the only context we're referring to, and in this case it is, but obviously it still just applies to movement in general. You could be moving house, and if you try to pick something up and the weight's further away from you, you might be like, oh shit, that's heavy. But you wouldn't think, it's the leverage, and you wouldn't go into that brain because you're not in the gym. So some people wouldn't think that way. But yeah, I found jiu-jitsu to be an interesting one to learn about, I guess, even just joints because I've been, I guess, stiffer than I realized and having to be more flexible and learning more about things like that. And which is very much, pretty much the same thing of what we talked about. It's like, it's me learning, okay, well, I need to make sure I don't get into certain positions or alternatively, I want that person in this position because then I know that I'll have more leverage. If I get to this point, then they can't move. And so
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear you. I guess I don't know if you're even slightly interested in wrestling or anything. I know in America you guys do it a little bit more in schools and stuff, but it would be interesting to hear your take on some of the way they do things.
Yeah, I had a very short-lived wrestling career when I was in sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. But I've been exposed to a lot of jujitsu in the last couple of years because my cousins are jujitsu fanatics. And they're from what I understand, they're pretty good at it. And so a lot of times when they come over to my apartment or when I go over to theirs, they are practicing moves, they're talking about it, and they're obviously familiar with what I do. And so we kind of collaborate in the dissection of these different kinds of what are they called? Submissions, I
Mm,
guess. Um, and it's really interesting because all of and even just the anecdote that you gave, it's a very like first principle kind of anecdote, right? Because what you did was you said, okay, I have a body, I'm a human, and I have bones and ligaments and muscles and all these things. And whether I'm, on the jujitsu mat or in the gym, I'm just dealing with forces and I'm dealing with resistance. And we can sort of look at exercise and jujitsu on a continuum of just physical activity, right? Exercises of different kind that accomplish different goals. Right? One is resistance training, and the other is you're basically trying to, kill someone. And the most interesting thing about it to me is everything in jujitsu in terms of like the first principles of what you want to try to do to someone. It's like the exact, if you flipped resistance training on its head 180 degrees, all of the things that you would do in jujitsu, you would try to avoid, in the weight room, right? So, for example, I've heard of this move called a heel hook, right? And heel hooks just basically, apparently are just the destroyer of knees more than any kind of other move. And it was really interesting, for my cousin to kind of break down like, okay, we're going to put our hands here. And obviously, why do we put it on the heel? Well, for the same reason, that person was pinning your arm out to the side, right? Longer level to basically apply, longer lever to apply force from. And so I think that from that first principles based approach is very cool to kind of see how it translates in an inverse way, where we're intentionally manipulating joints to create problems in people's joints in jiu-jitsu. And then in the weight room, we're intentionally trying to load those joints so that we mostly are sort of targeting specific muscles, right? So in one case, it's like on the jiu-jitsu side, how do I apply maximal force to this joint to destroy it? And then on the resistance training side, it's like, how do I apply maximal force on this joint in the way that it's supposed to move so that I can adapt and so that I can load these tissues progressively? So it's kind of two opposite ends of the same spectrum. And to the point about, this really makes you think, I think, a little bit more about the conversation of strength in general and what strength actually is and what it means across context, because you were describing how you like to sort of do the defensive thing that people get annoyed about, where you keep your arms sort of closer to your body. And I've seen videos of highly competent, jujitsu practitioners who will say those kinds of things, and they'll describe them using words that are not quite accurate, but that people understand. So for example, like, is it technically true that you are stronger in this kind of position in terms of if someone is trying to pull you forward? No, like it's a much weaker muscular position, right? But from a bony perspective and from a torque perspective, the person who's trying to act against you is acting with a much shorter lever, a much shorter wrench to kind of move you from. So what you appear to be is you appear to be stronger because you have this sort of mechanical advantage in this position, when in reality, the muscles themselves might not actually be, from a tension perspective, in a better position to produce force. So it kind of gets you thinking about all the things that we talk about in relationship to strength, and how ultimately strength is really, and this is something that Tom Purvis, had said years and years and years ago, which is essentially just strength is torque. And really this sort of what he calls the tug of war of torques between the strength of the resistance and the strength of you. So going all the way back to our initial conversation about the dumbbell lateral raise, like if you were lifting a 20-pound dumbbell and you could hold it, out to your side for 30 seconds, and then you move that 20-pound dumbbell and you taped it, right above your elbow so it was half the distance, you would appear much stronger, right? You would be able to hold that dumbbell out there for a much longer period of time because the torque is literally half the amount, right? But you didn't get stronger. You just changed how the resistance was acting on you. So I think when you start to see strength through this kind of a lens, you start to realize that all of the traditional stories that were told about strength are kind of not necessarily wrong, but I just think misguided. And why we can see so many people who present as very strong, they can lift very heavy weights, right? But they might not muscularly be very big. And, the only reason that could be the case is because strength is not the same thing as what I think most people think it is, which is this, again, strength is very nebulous in terms of what I think the world means when they call, when they refer to something as strong or as having strength. But I think that this conversation and sort of every branch of it specifically that we've had speaks to really what we're actually trying to talk about, which is just, resistance and in our interaction with it, in various scenarios. So that was kind of cool to see, how that one example, again, from a principle-based standpoint, kind of came full circle there. Just across all the other examples that we talked about, the T-bar row, the dumbbell raise, the cable curl in terms of the anchoring, right? All those things are all really related to the same thing. We're just sort of talking about them in different contexts.
Yeah, I think doing it is helping me even just learn from that perspective as well. And I think that anything could, right? Depending on everyone has different physical hobbies, and I'm sure there's many different sports and activities that you could learn from in the same kind of way, where you and that could help your training and help you understand training a bit more. Like you said, they're obviously very different, and that's where I struggled, because I've sort of gone in and, it was immediately what people said, right? Because I'm not overly big, but I'm probably about 100 kilos at the moment. I'm not very lean or anything, but I'm bigger than some of the guys, and they're like 65 kilos and they kick my ass. But they were like, oh, well, you've got the strength. So they're like, wait until you get the technique. You've got the strength side of things. Even just rolling with you, even though I've got better technique, I'm struggling to get you in things just because I can grab your arm and you can just go, no, it's my arm, and where that strength alone is kind of just helping me survive half the time. And I still get pummeled and I'm tired by the end of it, but it's good because I'm able to understand it now, and getting loose can be very hard when obviously in the gym we're focusing on being rigid in a lot of cases. So it's definitely interesting, and it's been a fun topic to explore with you, man. So look, we can't talk all day, and I know you've got things to do. So I really appreciate you coming on, and I guess to wrap it up, I kind of want to. You mentioned maybe coming out here, but I don't know how serious you were about that. Can you actually ever see yourself coming to Australia or Perth?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fitness scene, as you know, is pretty huge out by you guys, and it's definitely a big trip. And I would want to make it more of an excursion than just a single weekend or something. But I would love to, find a place, find a time to get out there and maybe do a seminar or something. I've had interest from, a couple people. I don't know exactly where, but I could definitely see it as a future prospect at some point. Yeah, realistically.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if it's something that we can ever discuss in the future, man. Either where I work now is a small facility, we're like a private facility. It's not a 24-hour gym, and so that this is where we're hosting the RTS course. And so I don't know if it's something that we could look at in terms of like seminar related sort of situation. It would definitely be cool to have you involved if you were to ever play, like you said, plan something. I don't know if maybe you would do like Queensland and Melbourne and maybe Perth or something in some kind of like because Mike Israel just came out and did here, and so I know that. But as you said, it's a big trip because I want to come out there one day, and every time I sort of like look at it, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is going to be like if I'm going to come to the States. My understanding is I definitely can't do it for any less than a month and even then that won't feel like enough. Um,
Mhm.
where here it's like you kind of just can knock off a couple of cities, and then to be honest, everything else is just dirt and kangaroos anyway. Yeah, you're not missing heaps. But yeah, I mean, in New York, I actually have a relative out there, funnily enough. And so if I ever get over there, I guess is there an ideal place that I should go for food? Like, let's say I'm in New York City. I don't know how much you go there. Is there like I have this concept from watching mobster movies and shit as a kid, where there's going to be like an amazing pizza place, and that guy named Joey owns it, you know, and they're smoking cigars. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, so I'll just caveat this with saying I'm probably the last, not the last, but I'm one of the last people that you want to ask about like anything culture related. I'm not involved in the culture. I don't care about the culture. I'm not really particularly interested in my food. I on a daily basis, I pretty much cook here. I get sushi on the weekends. Like that's about as crazy as I get. However, I have had some pretty crazy and good experiences in New York City, and I can personally recommend as my number one recommendation, a place called Keen's Steakhouse. It's right in the middle of the Manhattan, right near the Empire State Building. So it's a good, it's an interesting location. It's very busy. Um, some people will argue for Peter Luger's, and I would actually argue for Keen's over Peter Luger's any day. 10 out of 10 times. Um, and I would say a close sort of second for me and before that, I'll just comment on the pizza stuff. I have not been overly impressed by the pizza here. People sometimes rave about it, like the dollar pizza. It's too thin for me. I'm not a big fan of thin pizza. If I'm gonna have a pizza, I like to be thick. I've unfortunately had very supposedly authentic pizza, and I ended up liking Domino's better. I haven't had Domino's in a long time, but I'm a Domino's guy just for reference. Um, but what I will say is there was this really good Italian place other than um, Keen's, because Keen's is kind of like a steakhouse. I'm forgetting the name of it now, which may, tell you how much I really care about the experience, but it was very good. And if I remember, I will send you the recommendation. But I have two main restaurant recommendations, and I would say, regardless of what you do, you have to go to a good steakhouse if you're in the city, and a good Italian place because I mean, steak and Italian. Who doesn't like steak and Italian? So those are my
Yeah,
recommendations.
yeah. I mean, that's what Italian is always like the safest bet. Or to me, it's like Italian and Mexican food. I don't think
Mm,
I've never been massive into. A lot of people here eat like Chinese and stuff. I have no issue with it. It's still good, but like Mexican and Italian, I don't think I've ever been let down by either of them, even when they've not been made that well. But I imagine in
yeah.
New York, probably there's some pretty good authentic places that make it like a lot better. So that sounds like it'd be interesting to try. But yeah, look, it'd be great, man, to meet you in person one day. If you would ever come over here, it would be wicked. I just love to come to a seminar as well. Like even just this podcast, the amount that I feel like I've been able to absorb, and it's like perfect timing because the RTS course is tomorrow, so I'm going to go in there with my head held high and torque equation and all this kind of shit. And it's going to probably not be even relevant to some of the stuff we talk about, but it's I like what you're doing and the idea behind it. Obviously we talked a bit about it the other day, that it's just education based and the way that you approach it. I've obviously followed you since we spoke the first time and a bit before that, and the content's been, very consistent, and I find that it's always been engaging, at least for me. And you're someone that I've recommended to people. Oh, this guy's actually pretty interesting. Some of the things he talks about, or I'll link someone something, and they'll go, "Oh wow, I've never actually heard of that before." So for being who you are, I mean, I think when we talked, I don't know if I had it wrong. Were you like 23 or 24? How old are you now?
I am 24 now.
You're 24 now, so you must have been like 21, 22 when we talked last time. So to be 24 and have that kind of knowledge, I think is not as common. I think a lot of people would. I know people who have uni degrees and they're not at that level. So I think it just gives me a lot of faith as a coach, and maybe other coaches out there, that if you just put the time and effort into educating yourself and trying to learn from the right people, that you can actually be a pretty valuable coach yourself. And it's not, there's no limit to what you can learn. And surrounding yourself with people who create content in a format that allows you to learn with an open mind, and kind of, as like I said, never being limited, is something that's important. So people like yourself are a really good example of that.
Well, I really appreciate, the kind words and all of that, and just, your support over this lengthy period of time that you've sort of been here since the get-go. So shouts to you for that, and thank you again for, the time and for having me on. And I think that if there's anything that I can maybe say that might be useful to anyone, is that just in regards to learning, um, don't, I think I used to be afraid of kind of branching out on my own and sort of starting to form my own thought processes. And I think that, everyone has to start somewhere with this stuff. And, I think I mentioned to just this to you before, maybe I didn't, but, someone like Tom has, I think a lot of people, and Tom Purvis specifically is who I'm referring to, a lot of people have been so strongly influenced by him without knowing it, which I think kind of speaks to his integrity and just what he's done with his career. And I think, he doesn't, he's not super well known. He has no interest in being a big social media name, but he's just kind of always, he's just been the person that has been putting in the work, from day one since the 80s, teaching people. And, I text him about every week now. We talk about just the most random shit that you can think of. And, he is someone who to me has been a really massive help and a massive influence along this journey. So shouts to him, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot of his thoughts sort of through someone else and through other people tomorrow and through the days that you take the seminar. But I think that if anyone is really, really looking to get into this stuff, like deep, not just like how do I grow muscle deep, he's definitely the person that I go to and recommend, even, beyond the stuff that I do myself. Although I do think that, the kind of spin that I put on things is a little bit more accessible, which I think a lot of people prefer. Just, I try to do my best at disseminating information without sort of degrading the quality of it. So yeah, shouts to Tom. And again, thanks for, the kind words and just having me on and chatting. It's an honor to just be able to talk about this stuff in a way that is genuine and authentic. And I appreciate it.
No, it's been my pleasure, man. And I think it's going to be interesting to, yeah, probably talk again in another couple of years and see where you're at. And I'm sure it'll continue to grow. And your course itself, I mean, there's something I guess that I should mention. People can find your own biomechanics course just through your Instagram or something as well. But that's kind of just structured around. Do you have a plan to release it in sort of levels, or is it structured a certain way?
So, yeah. So what I tried to do with that course was make it as uh, user friendly as possible in terms of just covering as much of the basic stuff that I think most people need because, like as a trainer, I think there's only so much of the stuff that you really need to learn. And a lot of it, once you learn it, needs to just be like an experiential kind of thing. Like if you learn the basic physics stuff and you know nothing about, the muscular anatomy and you just study the joint anatomy in tandem with the physics stuff, I think you can get as far as anyone has gone, just sort of playing with those first principle concepts. So the answer is no, there's not really multiple levels at the moment. But I am about to start up in February, my second cohort of my personal trainer mentorship. So that's basically just for anyone who is, a personal trainer who is interested in the deeper dive, deeper level, how do we now apply this to a client-based real person scenario? And that's like a 6-week long thing where I basically essentially use the course material as a lot of the actual course content, but the presentation is very specifically catered toward trainers and people who are actually working with other people. So that if there's anything to plug, it would be that because just time wise, it's starting it up in February. So I'm going to announce that actually tomorrow. So that's pretty much what I got going on at the moment.
Yeah, awesome, man. That sounds interesting. Something I might have to look into. I feel like that's where I'm understanding education now is not necessarily an 80 grand uni debt. Not saying that that doesn't have its own place. It's probably where I'll head eventually. But I think at the moment I'm trying to focus more on learning rather than worrying about, I guess, what kind of piece of paper I'm going to get because I'm realizing that learning we are only we are only given so much time and we need to be specific about what we want to learn, and I shouldn't rush into maybe learning for 4 or 5 years about only 40% of what I want to know and what I'm interested in. We all have to learn stuff we don't necessarily want to know, and there should be an element of that. But I think that uni's a scary route to go down, or college. It's one of those things you can end up halfway through a degree going, damn it, this is not what I wanted, and this is not even going to apply to what I want to do with my life. This is probably not how I should have gone about it. And so that's definitely like, I'm 28, so I'm like in the peak of like, what are you going to do with your life sort of thing. Like I know what I want to do, but how do I go about it is maybe more accurate. So learning from people like yourself and other people is a good way to do it, because then it helps you kind of, well, you're learning about something you're interested in. So then it pushes you more in the direction of doing more of that, as opposed to maybe just heading down like, oh, I'm going to become an exercise physiologist to then be an overqualified personal trainer, you know? So, which is, yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
how common it is there,
sure.
but it's common here. um,
Yeah.
but I will try and get through this time. Let's see if I can manage it. I will give a shout out to Achievement Apex and Power Pit Rockingham, as well as Bulk Gym Chalk and Ped Test Australia and Rockingham Supplement Mart, as well as Thirst Trap. Boom, look at that. I made it. I've been waking up throughout the podcast. um, and I will give a shout out to you, man, for being here. And I look forward to seeing what you do in the future. I will say to you, enjoy your evening, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you, brother. Likewise.